We came up with the name Ardent when we were a bunch of 15, 16-year-old kids. We didn't pay much attention to what it meant. We just thought the word sounded cool. Later on looking at the dictionary definition, it's hot, fiery, fierce, burning, passionate. So, not ill-chosen. My friends and I were fascinated by radio. We would listen to out-of-town stations when we could. We listened to WLS, WABC. The in-town station that we listened to was WDIA and WHBQ, where Dewey Phillips was. There were actually 3 conspirators in this crime. Besides myself, there was John King and Fred Smith. We were fascinated with radio and the idea of having a radio station. We in fact had a little pirate radio station. Fortunately, it was low power and we were lucky not to be arrested. That interest in radio, the music that was being played on the radio, and in electronics, it led to the idea, well, you know, if we can do radio production, maybe we can actually record music. Originally, the studio was configured more or less like a radio production studio, but there was a large enough room that you could set up microphones and record a band. Some of the first victims were our friends who had bands in high school or junior high school. They would become the guinea pigs for our recording experiments. And there was a horn band that was very popular on the college circuit called the Ole Miss Downbeats, and we issued a couple of singles on them. My dad was in the building material business, which is pretty far removed from music. And you would ordinarily, I think, expect most parents to be sort of opposed to this. You know, who's staying up late, who's hanging out with musicians, what is this loud noise that coming from these bands? But strangely enough, they were supportive. And the general routine was, you can do anything you want to, just do it well. The next step in the garage saga was meeting Jim Dickinson. I met Jim through a guy that worked in music stores named Bobby Fisher. And Bobby had come across a local band, and he introduced me to Jim Dickinson with the idea that maybe Jim would work with him. They originally had another name, but Jim made up a new name for them, Lawson and Four More. We began recording them while we were still in the home studio and continued to record them when we moved into our first commercial premises on National Street. I'm not a person who believes in coincidence, okay? It just so happened that the keyboard player in Lawson and Four More was Terry Manning. The thing that occasioned our move from the home studio to a commercial building was the fact that my parents had decided to sell that house, and at that point I'm having to make the decision whether this is a hobby or is this something I'm at least going to give a try as a professional career. I chose the latter, and we went out looking for a building. The year for our move to National was 1966, so I would have been 21. I wish I could say we had a real business plan. The business plan was, we're going to try to make a pretty nice studio over here and maybe things will work out. Jim Dickinson was sort of producer in residence, and Terry Manning became the first engineer other than myself. At the time, the Batman TV show was coming in, and Jim had heard a promotional announcement that the network was running before the first show ever aired. And he could make out a little bit of the music in it. And he said, you know, we need to do a Batman song.
A strange signal flashes across the midnight sky, striking fear into the hearts of every evildoer. Batman! One last thing, darling.
The neat thing about some of this that I've experienced is the multi-generational nature of the thing. Jim Dickinson was producer in residence. Today we're recording his sons in the North Mississippi All-Stars. In 1966 and 67 we were recording Sid Selvage. Today his son Steve Selvage plays guitar on most of our records that are released on our label. There's something about that that makes it worthwhile. My first connection with Stax was 14, 15, 16 years old, going down to the satellite record shop. They would get the good stuff first that the suburban stores would not have. I'm not sure I even knew that there was a studio. The professional contact with Stax began as we were building the studio on National. A fellow walked in one day and his name was Welton Jatan. He said, "You know, we heard you were building a studio. This is an input module that we're building for a console that we're furnishing to Stax. We ordered a console using the same components, amplifiers, equalizers. At the same time, we purchased our first multi-track machine beyond a stereo machine. We thought we'd died and gone to heaven. We've got 4 whole tracks." Welton told the people at Stax, "Hey, I'm doing a console for these Ardent people. If you need to do some extra work, you probably ought to go over there because they're going to have similar equipment and there are people over there that know what they're doing." It's amazing that they trusted us. I was 21 and I looked like I was about 16. I knew what I was doing, but there was absolutely no reason for anybody to think that I knew what I was doing. But I went from being in a home studio to, wow, we're recording records by artists we've heard of that actually get played a lot on the radio. That was a cool thing, but you realize pretty quickly, hey, there's responsibility that goes along with this role. There was a fellow named Don Nix. He had played in the original Marquis. He played baritone sax. One of the people that he went out on tour with was Leon Russell. And, you know, he was telling Leon about the studio, and one of our first high-profile clients to come from out of town was Leon Russell. Terry Manning had become acquainted with Jimmy Page because the Yardbirds came to Memphis a number of times and played. Terry kept in contact with him, and when they did the Led Zeppelin III album, Terry persuaded them to come to Ardent. There's nothing that makes people aware of you as much as a little tiny credit on the back of a record that does well. Between the work that we were doing for Stax and these other high-profile projects, the word was starting to get around. I keep thinking about the night in Memphis. I thought I was in heaven. ZZ Top came to Memphis frequently to play. Terry Manning made their acquaintance. With their second album, they started recording at Ardent. In the early 70s, Stax was expanding rapidly, and they decided that they wanted to create something that would be a rock brand. Al Bell talked to us about the idea of Ardent becoming that label. The very first artist on the Stax distributed Ardent label was a band from Oklahoma called Cargo. The second release was by a band called Big Star. Back in the 60s, Dan Penn was the producer of the Box Tops, in which Alex Chilton was the lead singer. The first song that he did at Ardent was Cry Like a Baby. And the first time I ever saw Alex was when he was sitting on the floor in the control room waiting to do his vocals.
The nucleus was Chris Bell, Andy Hummel, and myself, and Alex was making a move from New York back to Memphis, and when Alex joined the band, it then became Big Star. At that point, John Fry said, "Hey, wait a minute, you know, I've been thinking about putting a label together." He went over and talked to Al Bell and put that relationship in place for distribution by Stax. The first record came out and got a lot of press, and we did a little touring and played Max's Kansas City, and then everybody kind of lost interest.
It got tremendous reviews in the rock press, and it got played a lot on the rapidly growing numbers of FM stereo rock stations, which unfortunately had very few listeners.
Chris Bell quit the band. Andy quit just after the making of Radio City. And then Alex and myself decided to do another record with Jim Dickinson producing.
The recording process was extremely long. It involved lots of different genres, tempos, instrumentations.
It was recorded in '75, but wasn't released until '78. That's because nobody would touch it. It's a dark, kind of depressing revelation of a time.
The demise of Stax had terrible ripple effect consequences. It certainly deprived us of a major customer. But a lot of your friends didn't have jobs anymore. There were some times there in 1976 where I was saying to myself, you know, is this time to just chuck this? Not all of the artists and producers found it necessary to leave town. Alan Jones, the longtime producer of the Bar-Kays, stayed on. The Bar-Kays moved to Mercury Records, and Alan started recording the Bar-Kays here and then started a production company to which he signed a number of other artists. People were picking up some of the pieces. 2 and then ultimately 3 engineers who had worked at Stax started to work actively for us. William Brown, Robert Jackson, and Henry Bush. And much later on, Ron Capone. Some of the Stax writers stayed around, Homer Banks, and they were producing Jay Blackfoot and some other artists. The U.S. Bankruptcy Court was selling all of Stax assets. And Stax had had a fine mastering department and a good mastering engineer, Larry Nager. And we got the idea, well, let's not let this thing leave Memphis. Let's see if we can buy this, and let's see if we can hire Larry and start a mastering department. And that's what we did, and Larry was originally Ardent Mastering. He now operates it as L. Nix and Company, along with his son, Kevin. We started a production company to look for some projects and artists that we could develop. We found a wonderful little band called Tora Tora. A&M and Virgin started a bidding war over that band. I actually didn't like it. I just wish they'd stop and behave.
In 1987, I had graduated from what was then Memphis State and had a marketing degree and put a resume together and put John Fry down as a reference, and so I called John.
I said, well, you know, we are without somebody to do some of the things with our production company and some of our marketing of the studio. Why don't you come work for us?
John Hampton and Keith Sykes were developing John Kilzer, and that was my first artist to shop. It was the first artist that I got placed with a major label too, and that was Geffen.
We want people to know who Alex is, who never heard of Big Star. He's a great songwriter, and he's influenced me.
To have a band like The Replacements, who wrote a song called Alex Chilton, that was a really good experience and a great welcome back.
The Replacements were another Jim Dickinson production of a different decade, and it did start considerable alternative activity around Memphis.
If you're a fan of rock and roll, even if you haven't heard of Big Star, you owe them, because I guarantee you, any band that you like did hear of them and listen to them and do their best to do as well as they did. It gives me a huge amount of pleasure to present Big Star.
REM is one of the bands that acknowledges a Big Star influence. One big highlight of the late 80s would be the REM Green album, recorded and mixed in Studio A. When Tora Tora was signed to A&M Records, the A&R contact was a young man named Brian Huttenauer, and he had signed another group from Arizona called the Gin Blossoms. He called up one day and said, I've had these guys with another producer, we've done 6 songs, it just hasn't worked out, and we've used up a lot of our budget. I'd like for John Hampton to take a try with these guys. Here's what I've got left in the budget, and you think you can give me an album for that? I said, yeah.
The Gin Blossoms were one of those projects where I walk into the studio and think, wow, this is something special to me.
Jimmy started recording here first when he had the Fabulous Thunderbirds. Jimmy had this whole thing about the vibe of being in Memphis. He just felt like if he was in Memphis, that he was going to have a creative energy that he wouldn't have if he were somewhere else. Stevie Ray came and did a solo album that was produced by Nile Rodgers, and then he and Jimmy returned to do the family style record, the last record that Stevie recorded. I became a Christian at the end of 1978. One of the first Christian rock bands was a band called DeGarmo and Key, and they lived in Memphis. They always had these tiny budgets, and I said, well, one of the first things I can do is maybe I can support this Christian music. We started recording a lot of contemporary Christian projects. By that time, Eddie DeGarmo, who had been in DeGarmo and Key, was a partner in Forefront Records, which was becoming very successful in this field. He said, why don't we do a joint venture? The first Big Tent record went right to #1 on the Christian radio charts. Our second artist was Skillet. Their first record in the mid-90s, it was really aggressive for Christian rock music. Ten years later, we're still issuing Skillet records. They have a new album out now called Comatose. Just this week, the first single went to #1 on the Christian rock radio chart. When Jack White came to Ardent, he came to work with John Hampton. The tape format for the White Stripes album that he mixed here was 8-track analog. When I first heard that we were going to have to rent 8-track heads, I said, this is a gimmick. But I came to the conclusion, if it's a gimmick, it was a good gimmick, limiting what you had room to do in a positive way. John Hampton received a Grammy Award, Best Alternative Album, for mixing a project from 8-track analog. The Raconteurs, again, 8-track analog. You know, I love new technology. Just because you've got it, it doesn't mean that you need to use all of it all the time. When Fox came up with that '70s show, the music supervisor decided that the tune that typified the '70s was In the Street off Big Star's first album. Big Star is still a performing entity today. We talk about Jody Stevens working at the studio. His other occupation is drummer in Big Star. One of the things that kind of irritates me is that these people outside of Memphis think that, oh, well, there were great musicians in Memphis, but they're all dead. We did a record on Cat Power, and they used Memphis musicians extensively.
Yes, I was jealous because you were small.
We have some of the best studio musicians and singers in Memphis still right now today. It's unfortunately one of our best kept secrets.
Life beating high, the anchor to a ship so warm.
If you had several years ago said that 2 locally based films were going to go to the Sundance Film Festival and win, most people would say, well, you're just dreaming. The best friend that music has is a healthy film industry. In a single year, we had 3 music-themed films shot in Memphis. The score for 2 of those, Hustle and Flow and 40 Shades of Blue, was recorded in Memphis. Music is emotional communication. If it doesn't move you to do something, you know, be happy, be sad, contemplate, then it isn't any good. I have seen enough letters and emails from individuals who say that their lives were profoundly affected by hearing a particular song at a particular moment or crossroads in their life. And, you know, that's worth getting up in the morning for.
Ain't over for me. No, it ain't over for me.
Keep going.
I'ma step my game up and get what's coming to me.
Keep hustling, keep on hustling.
It ain't over for me, no, it ain't over for me.
Keep flowing.
I'ma step my game up and get what's coming to me.
Keep hustling, keep on hustling.
It ain't over for me, no, it ain't over for me.
Keep flowing, keep on flowing.
I'ma step my game up and get what's coming to me.